Turn it over to MP Rempel-Garner for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Marion, there's a news story this morning that talks about how the Toronto Dominion Bank had to pay a $6.5 million fine for the word that the article uses is cheating thousands of credit card companies for decades, or customers for decades. And the article talks about the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada and sort of that it might be a little bit weak. I'm just wondering if your department has undertaken any sort of review or provided any advice to the government about strengthening regulatory oversight in these areas, particularly through mandate reviews at the Bank of Canada, OSFI, or the FCAC.
If that's okay, I will answer that question.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, as you know, as public servants, we won't be talking about the advice we provide to the government.
So.
But we are, like, the department is always looking at ways to strengthen the financial sector system, its stability, its security.
Have you undertaken any review, any sort of like landscape review of the adequacy of the regulatory frameworks?
There's actually, in the summer, was launched a legislative review of the financial sector.
Okay.
And the consultation period just ended in September, and the department is currently reviewing the submissions.
Would you be able to provide the committee with interim documents or a summary of this, given the nature of this study that we're looking at right now?
Not at the moment.
Why?
Like, as I said, like the consultation period closed fairly recently, and the department is still in the process of reviewing the submissions.
Could you provide us with a summary?
Like it's.
Why not? There's many of you at the table. So you're saying your department can't provide a parliamentary committee with the undertakings of a legislative review?
We can provide a summary of we could share the documents for the
Perfect.
legislative review.
So any of the findings you will table with this committee?
Like, we're still in the process of...
Yes, but I just want the documents so I can read them as a legislator and provide recommendations to the government.
We need to go through the documents. Some of them, like, have been...
Okay, this is ridiculous.
Some of them we can not share
Like,
because consultation documents...
We'll do a production of documents. This is ridiculous. Okay. Mr. Marion, the European Union has regulation that limits interchange fees from 0.3% for consumer credit cards and 0.2% for consumer debit cards. Did you provide advice to the government that Canada should undertake similar regulations?
I mean, we, in our work, particularly that led to the recent agreements with Visa and MasterCard that saw the reduction of interchange fees for small businesses.
But that's a voluntary agreement, right?
It is a voluntary agreement.
So did you provide...
Having said that, I'd qualify it as a non-regulatory agreement. It
Right.
is an agreement, and they adhere to the agreement. They post the fees.
Did the government provide direction to your department to not pursue a regulatory framework on interchange fees and a voluntary framework instead?
So we've had a number of these agreements, 3 sets of these agreements over the years. The first set was negotiated in 2014 and brought into force
But
in 2015.
there's no formal regulatory framework, correct?
Those requirements are not set in
Correct.
regulations.
Okay, so
correct.
did the government provide you with direction to not pursue a formal regulatory framework for interchange fees being capped at a certain level?
We didn't receive any direction saying
Thank you.
that it shouldn't be done
Thank you.
regulatorily.
Did the government provide you any direction on ensuring or regulating or working something into the voluntary framework that you talked about, the voluntary agreement with Visa and MasterCard, to ensure that the savings from interchange fees would be passed on to small businesses when a payment processor is involved?
So just to be clear here, at the time of the fall economic statement in 2022, the government announced its intention, one, to negotiate.
So I'm running out of time, so I want to
appreciate
know-
that, but at the time, the draft legislation was tabled concurrently with the announcement, and the announcement said, if we cannot achieve this through agreement, we will proceed with regulating this in
But I'm
short
asking,
term.
particularly with regard to the payment processors like Stripe,
Right.
has the government provided you with direction to ensure that the savings on interchange fees from the deal with Visa and MasterCard are actually passed down to consumers and not hoarded by payment processors?
Right. So most merchants that are on Interchange Plus plans are de facto receiving.
But we don't know how many.
rec-
We don't know how many of those. Like you get that talking point, but we don't actually know how many of those clients are on Interchange Plus or not. So I'm asking why didn't the government, if that was to go to small businesses, did you provide advice to the government to ensure that those savings were not hoarded by payment processors like Stripe?
We have communicated in very clear terms.
Could you
government's-
table that communication with the committee? Anything written to the payment processors?
So we've spoken with the payment processors that our expectation was for any rate reductions.
Did you do that with Stripe?
We did.
Can you table
Absolutely.
that? Last week, you said.
No, I said absolutely.
Okay, so you can table any emails that you've had with them.
So it was done through verbal discussion, but at the same time,
When?
we communicated that certainly in July of this year, and I'd have to go back.
With who from the company?
With Stripe.
With who?
Brian Peters, I believe, is the gentleman's name.
Interesting. Last question that I have, and perhaps it's for Mr. Light. Payment processors are citing the increase in GST, HST, the change in ruling I will get into. You know what we're talking about on certain fees as the reason why they can't or aren't passing the savings from the interchange fees and Visa and MasterCard along to consumers. Were you lobbied by payment? Like, did you hear a lot of feedback from payment processors that they didn't want that change to GST, HST made? Like, was that a lobbying effort within the department on the behalf of payment processors to have GST applied to the fees? There was a court ruling, and then I believe that there was a change in policy, right, to ensure that GST did apply. Was that something that was like heavily lobbied in your department by payment processors?
No, we did not receive heavy lobbying. I point out that the tax also applied up until a 2020 court ruling. In 2023, we made an amendment to ensure that the tax reapplied.
Right.
So, but no, we did not see. We did receive some communication from acquirers asking for information, but we did not receive heavy lobbying.
Okay.
So, Mr.
Thank you,
Perkins, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. I'd like to start off where MP Rempel-Garner ended her round of questioning with regard to the interchange fees and the tax case, the claim by Stripe that somehow they're uniquely hurt by the GST, HST change, which isn't really a change as I understand it. So maybe we could tackle that part first. The GST being applied this year isn't new, is it? It was just, they got a 12-month reprieve, essentially, but they're paying what they were paying before.
Yeah, there's been no change. This is a longstanding policy that's been in place since the GST was introduced in 1991. It was well understood. Banks are often ambitious when it comes to challenging laws, and they took a swing at it. They lost at the tax court. They won at the Federal Court of Canada or the Federal Court of Appeal. We introduced legislation to unwind that decision, which was contrary to longstanding policy, and the tax was reintroduced. So it's not a new tax. It's not a new cost.
It's not a new tax.
No.
And it's not a tax that applies strictly to Stripe, is it?
No, it applies to all acquirers.
It applies to all of them. So far, they're the only company that I'm aware of that has come out and said that they're not going to apply the reduction, although a number of other providers have been silent. Are you aware, is there any other company that is providing these interchange services, these processing services, that is saying they will not pass it on?
I'm not aware of any others.
And what has the department done to reverse their perspective on it?
Well, we've had many conversations. In fact, this was quite a hot topic. If you recall, back in Budget 2023, we had a lot of conversations with industry. We had a lot of conversations with MPs and parliamentarians, and this should be a settled issue by now.
So there can be only one or two reasons why Stripe is refusing to pass it on. Either they're not as good at doing their job as their competitors and don't have as robust a technology that allows them to absorb this, or they're just gouging consumers. Do you have any idea which it is?
Well, I can't speak to Stripe's business practices, but what I would say is that the GST on the network fee is a very, very small cost as a percentage of the cost. So they have many costs they need to absorb. So it could be labor costs, technology costs, you name it. So to blame not passing this on to one small input to their overall costs would seem to us to be a bit disingenuous.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. I'm not sure which finance official to pose this one to, but I want to talk about Interac. You may have been aware that we've had a little chat here around all of these fees of Interac. We had a board member here in committee who didn't seem to know what the pricing was of the company that he is a board member of, which shocks me because every company I've been a board member of, I know what our pricing structure is. So I'm not sure how truthful he was, but in the end of the day, the e-transfer fees range from 6 cents to 43 cents, apparently. And apparently, if you are on the board of Interac, and in particular, if you're a co-chair of Interac, you're one of the two companies, coincidentally, that gets the 6 cents. And if you're not there, you have to pay the 43 cents as provider. So has the department at all looked into the anti-competitive behavior of Interac and the way it treats other financial institutions in the pricing?
Thank you for the question. We do work with Interac. Matters related to competition is one that we defer to the Competition Bureau. And so to the specifics of your question, I think those would be better posed to them.
But when you're forming public policy, and I served 8 years in a minister's office back in a long time ago, and the department's always working with the minister to look at issues, public policy issues, and certainly the Department of Finance, the Minister of Finance should be concerned with competition in financial services, and particularly in fees that are gouging consumers. So are you telling me that the minister and the department have never looked into this anti-competitive behavior by Interac that gives preferential treatment to the co-chairs of the board and treats everybody else differently and gouges them at a 98% margin difference?
So we do, again, work with Interac. There are a number of areas of interest with respect to pricing and so on. We haven't entertained agreements in terms of setting certain pricing for Interac. It's not something that stakeholders have raised with us. In fact, merchants that I deal with value.
Do stakeholders have to raise something for you to look at an issue? I mean, the issue here is that if you're being charged $1.50 on each end of the transaction, that's $3. And Royal Bank and TD are paying 6 cents. That's a monstrous amount of profit. And the department hasn't looked into that. And the department hasn't looked into, I also take it, the return on equity percentages on credit card business. I worked at a bank. I know that the bank I worked at, the return on equity was 52% on the credit card business. So their defense of this industry is BS in terms of the fact that generally the return for the entire bank is 10 to 12, 13% is their target. The department doesn't look into any of these issues, doesn't put forward policy to try and correct when you have usury returns on credit cards, or you have usury returns by 2, if not the 4 key banks on charging on Interac. You don't look at those issues at all?
We look at a number of issues, and thank you for the question. With respect to Interac, as I was going to say, merchants do value the services that they provide and want to maintain their access to Interac, whether it's payment receivable through e-transfer, payment expediency through e-transfer, as well as their debit service offerings.
Thank you.
Mr. Butzer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just kind of intrigued, Department of Finance here, about what your policy objectives actually are. Like, what are the guidelines, or I guess what are the guardrails that you guys have in place for your department on setting your policy? Like, when you compare what's going on in like the European Union, some other countries like that, they've been very aggressive on setting rate cuts and setting levels. They're way down here and we're way up here. Why is that?
Thank you for the question. I take it that you're referring to the interchange rates in this particular case.
Yeah.
Right. And so for Canada, the latest round of agreements to secure reductions in interchange rates for small businesses, we're really looking at how can we reduce meaningfully the interchange rates paid by small businesses, number one. Number two, let's make sure that those reductions aren't accompanying increases for other businesses. And number three, we wanted to make sure that consumers, Canadians, reward programs were protected, as they value those programs quite significantly. And so those were some of the objectives of going into the agreements. And then it's how do we want to structure this? How best do we deliver on those?
Okay, so I'm just looking at multiple things that we have heard in this committee so far. We look at the credit card companies, for example. All of their interest rates are virtually identical. Sure, there's multiple players in the market, but there's no true competition. If there was, there would be aggressive rate reductions happening. So why is the Government of Canada's policy not seeking to get those rates, to get that competitive nature restored, where we see that rate reduction happening, so that consumers and business get a better outcome here?
I mean, it's a good question in terms of what we're observing in terms of interest rates, for instance, and I can attest that there is quite significant amount of competition in terms.
Well, not
of,
really. It's not really, because they're all the exact same.
In terms of the agree that they're all the same, and I'd also mention that the gas prices in my neighborhood are all the same as well. But they compete fiercely with one another.
Well, if they did, their rates would be way lower.
They don't, because of vertical integration in the market.
But they do compete fiercely on their credit card portfolios.
Yeah,
with-
I mean, like
with one another.
the rewards are the exact same too. They all offer generally the same thing. In fact, multiple banks offer the exact same company as the beneficiary of the rewards, like Aeroplan or Avion or all these different things. But anyway.